Welcome back, America. I'm Hugh Hewitt in Studio West. As we continue to follow the devastation of the catastrophic fires, I do want to take a moment to cover another bit of news, which is of particular import to Catholics. And I got a note from my friend Archbishop Chaput up in Philadelphia, the retired Archbishop of Philadelphia. He said, you really ought to talk to Rusty Reno. And I listened to whatever the Archbishop says, and so Rusty Reno is joining me for the first time. Rusty, welcome to the Hugh Hewitt Show. I cannot believe I have not made your acquaintance before.
Well, I'm a great admirer of your show and think you're one of the smartest commentators out there, so it's a real honor to be on the show.
Well, it's good to have tricked you. I love first things, but it's good to have tricked you. The Archbishop wrote me after I made, I think, some passing comments about my despair, which is back. And I want to give the audience a little background. I was in the White House with Ronald Reagan when the bishops in the 80s would send dumb letters to Ronald Reagan about nuclear weapons and poverty. And I left the church for a long time. The Archbishop brought me back in. Now we've got a pope, and I know we're not supposed to say bad things, but the appointment of Cardinal McElroy to Washington, D.C. just floored me. Absolutely floored me. How did you react to it, Rusty Reno?
It's in keeping with this pope's behavior, and I think that the trends in the American church are very good. And this kind of misgovernance, while it's regrettable, will not have a long-term bad effect. The Washington diocese is actually in good shape. There's a lot of good parishes. They get a lot of vocations. So I think that McElroy will do some damage, but we have to be optimistic about the way that the direction the American church is going. Gosh, younger clergy, they're very impressive. They're very conservative theologically. They don't have the same mushy-headed views about politics that you described from that generation that produced the document on peace and then nuclear weapons and then the document on poverty, both kind of woolly-headed liberal thinking. So I guess I didn't lose any sleep over it, is the short answer.
Well, let's expand then. Give me some hope. My diocese is Archbishop Burbidge, who's very good. And my priests in Alexandria are very good. And I am very happy with young seminarians emerging across the United States. But our bishoprics, like Francis just doesn't like us, does he, Rusty?
I think it's fair to say that Pope Francis is anti-American. If you think about it, is it that surprising? A man of his generation from South America, they took the anti-Americanism from their mother's milk. They blamed all their problems on us, CIA intervention or whatever. That was the explanation for their own problems. And again, I think it's a generational thing. My experience is elite Latin Americans under 50 do not have that same knee-jerk anti-Americanism that the generation that was young when Fidel Castro took power has. And Bergoglio, Pope Francis, he's from that older mold. And I think he's largely ignorant of the United States. And he came on a papal visit, but otherwise has no experience in our country. And also, we should not underestimate the extent to which Vatican bureaucrats are cut from the same mold as Brussels EU bureaucrats. And
well, that's very well said. What I'm worried about is grandchildren, great-grandchildren, and the church that they will inherit worldwide. And I don't know anything about the College of Cardinals. I don't know these people. He just sort of randomly picks people. Do you think there's a good possibility that John Paul II can emerge from the next conclave?
Oh, gosh. I warned my friends when Pope Benedict resigned that we were very lucky for a very long time to have really towering men in the chair of St. Peter. These are once in a lifetime, once in a century. I mean, John Paul II was extraordinarily courageous and charismatic man who has unique life experiences under Nazism and communism. Pope Benedict was undoubtedly one of, if not the most learned man of his generation. So I just would urge listeners to have a realistic expectation about the next pope. But I would say this: we should not assume that because a man appoints cardinals, that those cardinals are going to slavishly follow his agenda. Uh, don't forget, every cardinal that elected Pope Francis was appointed by John Paul II or Benedict. And something similar will happen, I believe, in the next conclave. I think there tends to be a pendulum swing, and I think there's a lot of frustration in the global church with Pope Francis's style of governance, which is very erratic and authoritarian at the same time. It's the worst possible combination.
I don't think people outside of Catholicism know that, Rusty Reno. I think they look at him as being, the smell of the sheep, the original year of good press, the honorific movies and tributes he received. But he really is a cranky old guy who doesn't have an ideology. As far as I can tell, he doesn't have an ideology that extends far beyond, I don't like America, and I'm not going to promote Gomez, even though it's the largest archdiocese in the United States. He's not a conservative. I'm not going to put him into the college. It's petty. He is a petty pope.
That I agree with that sentiment. That's certainly what I hear from my insider friends, is that he's purely political. His nickname when he was Jesuit provincial was, I think it was the eel, kind of going this way and that way, without. And to your point about not really having ideology, I think there's a lot of truth to that.
Okay, so this brings me to the bigger issue. First things. It has for years been standing in the gap for Catholics who are center-right and other people of faith who are interested in discussions about faith. How is First Things doing? And have you put your toe into the podcasting water? I noted that you did a podcast that I haven't listened to yet, but I'm not sure it's a First Things podcast. I'm very into the mission of encouraging alternative media to displace and crush old media, legacy media, and First Things is part of that.
We have a monthly magazine. We have an active website, new material every day, firstthings.com. And we do have two podcasts, one that I do that talks about material that's been published in the magazine, kind of going back and talking to the authors and getting a deeper dive. And then Mark Bauerlein, my colleague, does one that treats new books, interviews authors of new books. But I agree with you. We're in an interesting time in terms of media. Boy, the collapse in trust of the mainstream media has been nearly complete. Don't you think?
Yes, I do. I talked about it with the former and future president on Monday. I think legacy media is bleeding out. He thought that might be a little bit tough, but then he ended up agreeing with me. They're not going to get viewers back until they change, and what they have to change from is ideology back to reporting. But in the meantime, there are places like National Review, First Things, Commentary, Mary Catherine Hamvick, they're pumping out good material, and the folks who are leaving old media for alternative media aren't going to come back, Rusty. I don't know what your subscription rates are like, but are you seeing growth in audience?
Yes, certainly. We get growth in audience. And I agree with you about legacy media. It's not clear to me, given their staffing, that they can really correct course. I mean, gosh, the outrage at the Washington Post staff with the decision not to endorse a candidate, boy, they really are going to have a hard time. The leadership of those organizations are going to have a very hard time correcting course. And look, Joe Rogan probably had more influence and reached more voters over the last campaign cycle than the mainstream, any CBS, NBC, ABC, MSNBC, any of those legacy channels did. Don't you think?
I do, and I wonder the source of the collapse. I grew up watching the Today Show. I grew up watching NBC News at night. I worked for them for a few years. But I do think if you take 2 generations or 3 generations of management and you instruct them to hire based on other than talent, you're going to end up with ideological factories of mediocrity. And that's what we've got. And I only subscribe to 2 newspapers now in the United States. I do the Financial Times, which I've given up on the economy. I've given up on a lot. Have you changed your consumption habits? I know you probably still read the Post. Everyone in the Beltway has to. It's still a company town paper. But have you changed your?
No, I don't read the Washington Post. No, you know, I started reading the Wall Street Journal when I was a graduate student 40 years ago, uh, and you know, the news page there is not as bad as the news page at the New York Times, but and I scan the New York Times over lunch. I mean, very just to see what they're up to. Um, but
I
I
cut the
agree
cord
with
to the New York Times. They're too bad. They won't report the truth, so I gave up on them. And I read the Free Beacon now, and I listen to podcasts and that sort of thing. In Catholic media, other than First Things, is there anything other than First Things?
we we are we're the spokesman for conservatively minded religious folks, especially Catholics. But there's a really great Substack called The Pillar, which does does the best in-depth reporting on really details about what's going on in church politics. They're a good,
Yes,
very
the
good
Archbishop
use.
has sent me there. That's too much detail for me. I just, I'm not. I'm not a theologian. I'm not you, Rusty. I'm just going along with the news business, and I just want someone to tell me what's going on inside of the church. And First Things has done that, but always with diplomacy. And this is my last question: are Catholics increasingly candid about the state of the church in Rome?
Yes, and I think people initially, for the first couple of years, maybe first half dozen years, they were open-minded about this pontificate. But I think people have made up their minds, and you know, famous line from Fiddler on the Roof about the Tsar can apply to the Pope. May God bless the Pope and keep him far, far away.
Rusty Reno, thank you. It is great to make your acquaintance. I look forward to seeing you inside the Beltway and having you back as new editions come out, new things to talk about. Thank you, Rusty. Good to have you.
Oh,
By
thanks
the way,
for
why
having
don't you
me.
have an X account?
In X, there's great temptation.
Okay, well said. That's true. I've been doom scrolling since the fires began, so that's absolutely true. It does tend to depress people if you stay too long on X. Rusty Reno, editor of First